Hello, everyone. We're going to take a look at some things that are important for composition when we're dealing with illustration. And one of the key things to begin with is stating that context is everything. Basically, what are your parameters that you're working within? You're usually given a design brief or some sort of uh, restriction that you're trying to work within and manage the design, manage the organization of the shapes that you're using to communicate the story, either for your client or for your own particular storytelling devices, whether they're comics or books or even just character design. But it's important to remember that these are rules in a sense, but more a framework or some sort of armature that you can build your design, your statement on top of. Any of these things can be thrown out in the right situation, and usually when you do that, it takes on more meaning. So really be conscious of when you choose to do something and why you're choosing to do it. So starting with things that we've maybe heard from other courses, and you might have just sort of naturally understand the concept, but overlap is key. This is a Norman Rockwell piece that's been dissected in terms of the kind of three values or two values at times of one shape, which is very iconic, very symbolic, very clear, identifiable figure, whether it's the dog, the rifle, or the man, and how do you organize those shapes in front of one another so that they still make sense. So I would particularly pay attention to the dog image on the lower left, where they're keying in on those moments of importance. That little shape in the middle, that triangle shape. If that wasn't there, it would be harder to connect the dog from one side to the other. And likewise, the overlap of the man's feet and boots over top of the dog's feet. If there was a little bit of movement one way or the other, it would be harder to tell where the dog's feet began. So it's a very interesting shape that's made as a result. You can create depth just through overlap. So there is very little to no atmospheric or rather linear perspective. There's no linear perspective in this piece. It's all flat shape, but because there is a value range or difference in brightness as it recedes back into space on the left one, we get some depth. Because of the overlap in the right one, we really achieve some depth. It's not a lot, not like the left one, but you know that the railing is in front of the person walking up the steps. Totally related to overlap are those moments where the overlap doesn't happen. It's just kissing an edge. It's just barely touching. So where a figure or an object just butts right up to something and it doesn't make that immediate push beyond the boundaries or stay within the boundaries. We call those tangents. Uh, we can also look at the spoon that's coming out of the corner as bisecting the corner where it divides it exactly in half. These things draw attention to those contact points and serve to kind of flatten the space that exists there. So you want to be really careful of that and watch for that. If you learn nothing from me, and I've seen this in courses down the road, this is the thing that students remember from my teaching is to watch out for tangents because it ends up becoming something that really is an eyesore or a moment of that stops the viewer from appreciating the rest of your picture. That being said, the left piece is taking advantage of a tangent for a concept, its purpose. It makes that figure feel bigger because it looks like they're pushing up that leaning tower. Now on the right one, anyone notice any immediate tangents? And I'll point the big one out here in a second. If you can't find it yet, look at the shield and look at Black Widow. She seems to be connected to that shield and almost makes her look like she's a small miniature. Rather than seeing her in the distance, it looks like she's almost walking right next to Captain America. There's all kinds of other issues with this poster, but that's a big one. And whatever you feel about the man, that is an interesting use of the microphone as a tangent point, and I'll leave it at that. Whether you disagree or agree, you have to appreciate the concept that is created through the design choice. Howard Pyle early in the 20th century, during a time when there was an emphasis on sort of flatness in design, was absolutely taking advantage of tangents here with intent to flatten the space. So if you look around the picture, kind of look for a few tangents, and then I'm going to point them out. So if we look at all those numbers, those are points of contact with either the border at the top with the guy's hat, the ship in the background just resting on the edge of that bank, the man kind of overlapped at the neckline, at the beard line. We lose the character's head a little bit. Shovel in the fore or midground is connected to the side plane. The guy bending over connected to the elbow. So there are intentional reasons why flatness could be useful. It's more decorative. It creates a concept potentially, but the same artist does this. So he's absolutely in control of the choices and decisions he's making there in the concept. In real life, tangents are going to happen. So James Gurney here drawing everyone that he sees, and you have to know when they're useful and know when they just feel awkward or bring too much attention to that point. It's like a buzz, a visual buzz that we want to kind of push that shape in front of it or separate them a little bit, and we remove that impulse. All right, this one's a little harder to find, but if you look at the standing man, look for some sort of confusion of space with him and the environment. And I'm going to point to it now. Look at that foot. The shoe almost feels like it's connected to the front edge of that chair, where it feels like the silhouette, when you squint, of the chair disappears and we just see the boot. All right, we're moving on to balance. And balance it's an intuitive feeling of equilibrium between the elements in your composition. So it's not something that can absolutely be measured. It's absolutely more of a feeling where it feels balanced or unbalanced. And we've got some examples of a fulcrum and lever, or you can think about it like a teeter-totter or a seesaw, where you have a heavy weight placed more closely to the middle, the fulcrum in the middle. And to balance that heavy weight, we move the little character further over to the edge. So if you think about this compositionally, if we move to the center sketch at the top row with the lady waving to the little figure in the background, she is the bigger figure. She's the dominant scale element. She's slightly closer to that dashed vertical line, which is in the middle. And the little character in the background gets pushed further away from the middle. He's actually closer to the side of the picture. And that gives us a sense of balance. And you can look at the other ones as continued examples of that same principle. We have symmetry here. We have asymmetry. So that same principle here on a regular teeter-totter, that figure would be flown off bounced off the edge of it. So again, we've got to move that character in towards the middle. All right, here we have symmetry. We're as close to perfect symmetry as we can get. Han and Luke on the opposite side of Chewie make it not quite perfect, but we're emphasizing that focal object in the middle. So we're looking at those three figures walking down the pathway, and essentially those elements on either side are reflecting one another. They're mirroring each other. So continued examples of that, and a few principles of composition where you can look for diamonds and diagonal relationships to kind of help continue alignments or relationships from one side to the other. Here we have more of an approximate symmetry, where those visual balances are not quite exact. There's repeating of certain elements, but they're more aligned with the idea of there's a center axis, and things sort of reflect on one side or the other and create some balance. So there's going to be variations. It can be horizontal, vertical, diagonal, but we're looking for rhythms that can kind of lead the eye around that central figure. Again, not an exact mirror. Obviously, the gender switches here, and the butterfly shapes in the background are slightly different, but it's still pretty balanced because of those center axis and very similar repeated forms. Here we have it more of a horizontal, and it ends up giving us a conceptual reason to use that approximate symmetry. Again, thinking of this almost in a conceptual illustration form, your figure in the boat has a choice. They can go one way or they can go the other way, and it represents a fork in the road, if you will. So compositionally, there's a intent behind using a symmetry. You can't weight one of those choices higher than the other. Not one's not necessarily better than the other, and that symmetry helps that idea. Really interesting diagonal approximate symmetry. So we notice the points that change. We notice the figure on the ground who's lost and the figure who's won by that contrast. Wes Anderson films are filled with symmetry, and it's very subtle approximate symmetry. Clouds are different, figures are slightly different. A few more examples. And then we've got not necessarily an idea of making it symmetrical, but using a center axis. So it's not a mirror reflection. The wave isn't reflected in the same diagonal on another side, and the harpoon isn't reflected opposite. So it's not a main attempt of repeating things. It's just there's a center figure, and you use those diagonals, you use the rhythms that move around that center form to keep the eye moving down the page. All right, here we've got balance with asymmetry, and we can look at it with that fulcrum idea and the teeter-totter. Major dark mass there around that smaller figure, big dominant element, and then the grouping of those three characters on the left in a sort of a triangular shape. Almost a perfect idea of the fulcrum and seesaw idea. The woman in pink, much closer to the edge, the guy in black, much closer to the middle. Little shelf or cart there with the vases up on the far right, closer to the edge. It's going to help balance the weight of all those figures on the left. Some of these mid 20th century illustrations were really dramatic in their use of empty space or space where there's minimal figures going on. Oftentimes that was because there was going to be some text on it, but they were really well balanced compositions still because of it. So these would have been in the Reader's Digest magazine. Here were some of the ladies' magazines from that time period that had really interesting narrative stories and figures, and they would throw big splashy typography across it for the title or little bits of dialogue at times. The knight here on the left, really close to the corner and side, helps to balance the angels on the right. Just keep thinking about these. And we'll move on to viewpoint and perspective. Ideally, we're thinking about your position as the artist as you're directing the story. So where do you place the camera? Where do you want the viewer to sit to understand your character, your concept, the scene that they're confronted with? What makes that tell the story in the best light? So move it around. As you're experimenting with your compositions, you've got to think about moving towards and away, above and below. Move the lighting so it's back behind the figure, in front of the figure, off to the side. Change it up throughout your experiments so that you figure out for sure that this is the way it needs to be. So here's a really good example of flipping the perspective or flipping the vantage point and telling two different stories here at once. So this is President Harrison, who gave a speech without an overcoat and caught a cold and eventually died very soon into his presidency. So from this vantage point, we have a really clear state of union or inauguration rather, and then we move this way and we read it as a coffin with mourners at that scene. The viewpoint and perspective can tell your story. So a low angle, a low vantage point. If anyone's familiar with Game of Thrones, we know Tywin Lannister here walking into the throne room to meet the king or to see the king, his grandson. We know who's in power, and it's not the one on the throne. Because of that vantage point, because of that low angle, that figure becomes more dominant on the right than the one on the throne. Similar idea here. The goalie is very diminutive compared to the figure coming straight at him. Opposite way, we're viewing the figure now from above. She seems much less intimidating, and we can kind of look around and understand a few things if we start to see the narrative elements that are thrown in there. She's fallen off her ladder. She's been hanging drapes or things, and there's 2 feet on the right there. So someone has walked in, maybe she's been startled. Unfortunately, I haven't read this story, I haven't been able to find it, but there are multiple things going on here. She's got paint, she's got tacks and scissors, and there's a ton of narrative story happening in this picture without even necessarily knowing everything about it yet. Again, looking down on that figure who's smaller, we get a feeling that that's not the intimidating one, it's the one that we're almost right over their shoulder. Really interesting part of the storytelling here. We're right up there with him on that ledge. So the vantage point helps the story, helps it feel more dangerous than it would be as one of the crowd on the ground on the streets looking up. That's not the interesting vantage point necessarily. Really unique vantage point, not one you see every day. So always be looking for those things that might stop someone in their tracks. Things that can be funny even. Same idea. Visual puns or visual play of foreground background relationships that start to feel like they're connected. So this is a funny use of that kind of overlap or tangent confusion. Cropping can tell a story. Most of us probably understand that Napoleon was pretty small and diminutive, so cropping him really low in the composition adds that visual play, if you will. It makes us almost laugh for a second because of that. All right, so composition, this is one of my favorite things in composition is when light and dark flip-flop, counter change. It's called a counter change because it's a reversal of tone between the figure and the background. So the counter flips, it changes. And you look at that light half of the figure, she's brighter than the background. You shift downward, she's darker than the background. So the contrast literally changes. It can be pushed for effect. So that tower on the left piece, not necessarily there in the composition originally. It adds drama. It makes it feel taller. It makes the clouds feel closer to it because the cloud is casting a shadow on its top. It adds a more of a quality to it, a more unexpected quality, and it creates contrast on top and bottom. Trees will often do that as they overlap in front of the vegetation in front of you versus the sky above. A couple more examples. Hugh Ferris does this a ton. He was an architectural illustrator in the early 20th century. If anyone's heard of the movie Metropolis, and even influenced some of the Batman movies with Tim Burton in terms of that dark noir kind of look, very much in keeping with that early 20th century aesthetic. A few more examples just because I love counterchange so much. So Lincoln's coat is brighter at the bottom, he gets dark at the top. The tree you can certainly see is a gradation. Some super scary images from the Scary Stories books, if you ever read those when you were a kid. And last version of counterchange, Andrew Wyeth. Okay, now we're looking at pattern. Pattern can take any number of meanings, light and dark, literal, wallpaper kind of print or pattern on on the wall or sofa or shirt or dress, but really think about how the light and dark contrast are balanced in your picture. How do you create pattern? How do you create interest in those shapes? Gestalt. And this is where we're thinking about the relationships that create a whole. And so one of them would be closure, which is the idea that we have a tendency to group and close shapes even when part of it's missing. So we don't have an outline around these figures, but because of the patterns, because of the lines, we close that shape off. We create a silhouette or a figure from that without looking at them necessarily as individual lines. We see them as a group. Usually proximity is important for this as well, because if they weren't close together, we wouldn't see them as connected as much. Here we have similarity. So we group things via commonalities. The shapes on the right that are circled in red have that orange brown color. So they all kind of group. The camouflage on the left groups the figure with the background because it's similar. Here we've got pattern, light and dark pattern, textural pattern, both drawn texture, drawn shapes, as well as texture of the pencil application as a pattern. Conceptual use of pattern. So the left one was he's a therapist who was deeply ingrained in the idea of astrology and astral projection. So the stars become the little buttons on the old time sofa. And the sofa or chair pattern on the right, turning into the snake pattern, conceptually ties them together. Emphasis here more on the 2D design element, surface pattern, less about necessarily concept as much as decoration. Repetition. We can repeat anything in the composition. Literally, it can be shapes, it can be colors, it can be lines, it can be rhythm. This is not necessarily something that you just pull every ingredient and make it work together. You think about how repetition moves the viewer, creates a rhythm. Proximity of these shapes is going to be important to how the repetition works. You can repeat things all across the composition, or you can repeat them very close together as these are, where they tend to group. There's no right or wrong in either case. Just think about how the repeated element becomes important for the composition. What else does it add to it? So here we're repeating with color, and it certainly emphasizes the main figures in the foreground and helps them sort of connect to the city life as that similarity happens in the background. Repetition of the color helps balance things. There's almost an approximate symmetry on the right piece with the figure with the tail on the left and the sculptural element on the right. Similar height, similar color, similar light and shadow pattern. So it does help to bring some balance there. And you can start to look at how the light colored green or the blue green kind of bounces around and feels well circulated. The next two pieces are some of my favorite to talk about for composition. And really one of the ones that I learned how composition worked on would be this one. We want to look for variety. Look at how the repeated elements are similar, but they vary. So circles. Circles happen all over this place. Donuts. There's a coffee cup. The saucer underneath the coffee cup. There's a stool behind the woman. There's another plate in the background and then a cup near it. There's a directional path between those as well, those ones I just named. So it has a V shape on its side. And that comes right back down through the man, through his forearm to his coffee cup, and then back over to hers. And her spoon points you back into it. There's repetition of the gray. It's a limited color palette. So the grays and reds that kind of bounce around the composition. His hat is kind of toned gray. It's a little reddish gray. So it's similar to her rain jacket, but it's not exactly the same. And that's not exactly the same as the napkin holder, which is a little darker. They bounce around conceptually. There's a little bit of a yellow on his tie, which is pretty saturated, and that's on top of the sugar uh, or cream or whatever that is right in front of him. And that color is also a brown version. A brown version of that yellow is his coat, and in the donuts and in the coffee. So that similarity of color, similarity of shape, is helping conceptually, or compositionally rather, move us around the picture. Here we've got a conceptual replacement where we're bringing the plate from the stegosaur to the gas station sign. Really interesting design choice there, and then a really nice flow around that figure. You can also look up at some of the verticals. The verticals repeat very two-dimensionally as the stegosaurus curves around that space. So we repeat some of the vertical lines across the picture, creates a rhythm, moves you back up into the stegosaurus's back. Here we're replacing that symbol of the gun imposed over top becomes the eye. We're replacing the peace and dove form with the warplane dropping bombs. Very one-to-one comparison. Jumping off the deep end here as you graduate, and combining that platform for jumping off into the water with the graduation hat, replacement of a symbolic object. Repetition with variety. How do you create interest so we don't get bored seeing this again and again? As if anyone could get bored seeing pie, but the idea that the subtle color differences, subtle mark making and textural differences, height differences, they add just this little subtle movement and change and shift from one to the other. Continuing that idea of variety, we can look at intervals. How do things change? The bird pattern is very regular all the way across. The only thing that changes is the last one's foot drops down. So we look at that as an anomaly. It becomes a focal point because of that, as well as because of the curve of that rope. And the rope has a nice dominant relationship, mama bear, papa bear, and baby bear kind of scale. So we got a really big rope, we got a medium-sized rope, and we got a small little rope on the right edge. So we look at those things as having variety as well. The curvature of that bottom rope leads up through the drips that are coming down in white, which kind of echoes that curve and mirrors the rope that was moving towards the right side. This piece has a ton of rhythm and movement because of those repeated lines, repeated shapes, and curvilinear forms. We would certainly compare this to something in music. How do the beats move? Is it a very regular thud or beat, or is it more interesting and spontaneous? How do you balance those changes from one to the next? We can absolutely do this with panel structure when we get to comics as well. So very regular, consistent squares. How do the beats change within them? What's happening within them? This is a relatively regular, though, pattern. And when we move into comics, you can have all kinds of changes in those panel structures to create different rhythms. But we might be looking at landscapes, and you may not have as much control or think you have as much control over this, but take control when you're sitting in front of the scene. The potential for certain trees to just naturally have equal intervals or spacing happens all the time. Make it different. Make it change. Otherwise, it can flatten. It can make it more boring. So look at the space in between these, the gaps between them, the diagonals between them. They all slightly change a little bit, and that creates rhythm. It creates movement through the picture. We can look at rhythm here as we move across. Very bright hat on the left. Maybe we jump to that top one in the back, the red one. Maybe we jump more quickly to the middle one, and then down through the woman's face to the one she's holding, back down to the blue one. But at the very least, you go 1, 2, 3 across. There's a spacing difference, and it changes in height slightly. That's rhythm. We're absolutely going to start to apply this to the figure, both in animal form as well as when we start to deal with things that are more humanoid. There are all kinds of things we can play with gesturally with that. Look at the arrows on the figure on the right and how they swoop around the volumes of the body, especially from the hip across the front of the leg to the back of the leg. It throws that curve of the front thigh back over to the calf muscle of the lower leg. That curve then throws back towards the lifted up foot, and then that would come back in around on the heel through the toe. So that sort of flips back and forth across the figure. That'll be something we look for a lot. We can look at rhythm within the mark making. Paul Klee, mid 20th century pencil artist, does these amazing hatching textures within his work. So you can zoom in and really see every single mark and plane and structure on the face or the body that might be created. We can look at that in paint strokes, brush strokes rather. The form on the forehead on the right figure feels very solid and spherical or full of volume because of the tracing of those brush strokes around that shape of the head. Wind pattern, something we can't necessarily see, but it's given visual because of the directional flow. More of a non-traditional design, the X compositional design. And Mike Mignola from the Hellboy series is a huge fan of the X composition. So if you pick up almost any piece he's done, you can find some evidence of really directional crisscross that kind of focuses our viewers' attention on that main body or main figures. A couple more, really using the X design. And it's not getting stuck in that middle. There's plenty to balance the figure, balance the composition around that center point. And usually the center point's not right in the middle. So the figure on the from Frankenstein who's on the ship mast, the bright part of the face, which is where we're going to naturally kind of go to because of its contrast and because it's a face, it's nowhere near the middle. It's up a couple inches and it's a little bit to the right, and his figure's looking over to the right anyway, continues to push that direction a little bit. All right, here's a piece that I've done back, too long ago now, but it's one I can really talk about in terms of using alignments to design your picture. And this is what I did. This is what I was looking at, even from the beginning at the pencil sketches. I'm looking at all these blue lines here and all these yellow lines here, guiding design choices. Where do I place some of those subway goers figures in the background in relationship to the main figure in the middle? Look at the glove diagonal and how that leads up through certain things to the mural even in the top. That those are important elements that give structure to the overall picture. So we can look at this one and we can trace out those alignments as well. We can look at this and find any long diagonal and carry it along. Where does it lead to? Look for something important. Look for a vertical. All the framework that's happening on that left side. There's diagonals that lead through the main figures into the rifle with the bayonet. The vertical, the first vertical is almost in a rhythmic fall when you move from that vertical to the second figure, or the first figure rather, into the second figure, leans over and seems to fall into the composition, almost reflecting what's happening to the window on the right, where the losing my train of thought, where the structure is falling off of that window. And any vertical, any diagonal that you can see seems to have some sort of reason or purpose for being there, to lead the viewer to kind of group in with another line of 3 or 4 that create a rhythm. Another one with a lot of great rhythm, really interesting path for the eye to take. Obviously the fence is going to do that. Look at the repetition of the curve of, or not curve, but the bend of the knees on the woman that's being carried up. That's repeated in the buildings in the background, the roof lines. Look at the angle of the tree and the bend back in there, how that repeats the angle of the fence post, or even the woman coming up the stairs, her arm, very similar in form to the tree structure. Lots of alignments going on here. Again, carry any of the lines outward, they're going to lead to something. Uh, any of the umbrellas kind of lead up to a mast. The diagonal of the figure, the male figure in the middle, leads up through the ship in the back, and we get a sense of balance with that oarboat or rowboat rather on the right that's coming in. Brighter contrast gives a little more importance and weight, helps to balance the figures on the left, which have a lot more contrast, a lot more interesting color, a lot more narrative connection there as well. Here we get really interesting connection from the foreground to the background in sense of scale. Ship in the background versus the major form, dominant form in the foreground. We get diagonals repeating with the ship and into the clouds. They point down to that smaller boat in the really far distance, which our figure in the boat in the foreground is obviously looking towards. Okay, looking for alignments here. They all lead right to the central figure. You can hear it alignments for this piece. Lots of directional movement. Lots of ways for the eyes to move. We don't get bored. It's not a one-off, 1 second look and we're gone. There's a lot of information to kind of dissect and move around the picture. Watch the viewer or the boy's eyes. They gaze down almost towards the gulls in the background. Those diagonally relate through his leg, through the weather vane. The north-south line kind of lines up with the lighthouse height. The vertical of one of the ships in the background kind of points up back towards the boy's head. It's everywhere. Great place to look for it in still life. So look at all the diagonals. Look at the interesting shapes of triangles happening to the folded papers in the background. And really even the ground space, the wall in the background. It's an interesting puzzle piece up towards the corner, but not quite into the corner with the paper. Over on the other side with the mask hanging up, casts a shadow, cuts into that shape in an interesting way where it's a hard edge and it's a soft edge. The drapery or the piece of fabric that comes forward and off the edge breaks the movement of the viewer's eye across this desk or countertop. So we continue to look for variation, scale variation, texture variation, contrast of lights and darks, midtones. These are full value pieces with a really good understanding of how to balance light against dark, dark against light. Top right one's got a really interesting counter change, bright moving across the dark of the tail and flipping what's behind it to make that stand out. All these are going to have really good compositional back and forth value pattern, shape design. Where do you point a figure? Does it feel like it leads towards something? How are those values balanced to create a pattern? This is very interesting local color relationships. It's a dark glass base. It's a brighter apple, but it's lighter on one side and darker on the other. It's a dark box underneath a lighter colored pitcher next to a wine bottle that's darker, which has a lighter tea kettle in front of it. Light, dark, midtones organized exceptionally well here. Same ideas happening in this. Lots of good value relationships, interesting patterns and paths for the viewer to take into it. Not just one level, there's multiple heights that move the viewer up into space as well. And it's always interesting to see people take somewhat alternative approaches to still life, which, for all intents and purposes is really old as an idea. We've been seeing still lifes forever. How do you make it new? How do you make it contemporary? So these play a little bit with two-dimensional abstraction as well. Really interesting dark ground shape, that background shape, when it's cut out compared to the brighter shapes in the foreground. So there's a real heavy abstraction that almost creates some flatness to contrast those more rendered forms. More playful use of color, balances around the picture, with a lot of saturated forms. Whereas the saturation here on the left piece really puts a focal point on that red. It's more subdued red in the other ones. So in the bottom right one, it shifts in contrast to the green. Green is now more saturated. So we start to look for subtle variations to control where the viewer goes. Product photography always has a really good compositional design approach. Oftentimes it'll be something very grid-like. Those of you that might be interested in graphic design can probably appreciate the two-dimensional kind of grid design that's happening or overlaid on top of this. Repetition with variation. Where do you place the potatoes? Where do you place the white elements? The garlic compared to the crinkling of the cloth. There's some similarity there, as well as to the crinkling of the bag. And all three are white. Repeated bags, repeated little gourd elements, but all slightly different. We open a drawer to make it more interesting. We bring the purple from the bag into a ribbon. We draw down, not quite central, off center, so that you draw a rhythm between the vertical lines as well, from horizontally moving from bag to bag, as well as down now vertically. Really interesting depth control here, sharpness in the foreground, softness in the back, pretty compelling scale differences as well between the objects, big, medium, small, even smaller, and some similarity in heights that start to draw through main figures. So take a horizontal line, draw it across, where does it line up? It probably hits something. Boy, and this, if nothing else, this is the idea that find interesting things to draw, find interesting objects. Don't just pick up your cell phone and draw that and think it's interesting. You've got to search out and seek out shape, contrast, things that are going to be compelling to look at. You're in control of the compositions, what makes your work fun to stare at. Even just cutting up fruit can be interesting. So there's a really interesting complexity of color as well as paint handling, but the way that the cantaloupe here is staggered creates a rhythm. The proportion that's shown, the interior parts create a curve that leads you back down to the smaller pieces of the rind. Those shapes of the smaller pieces of rind reflect the shape of the knife in a way. So complexity can be built into the most mundane things that you can find, but you've just got to really do it. You've got to make it happen. Okay, we've got a few more left. We're going to start to look at how the narrative can be more driven by the choices that you're making and what that might tell us about the character. So here we obviously have a writer. They've got a thesaurus, they've got a typewriter, there's a manuscript going on in progress. But there are other things at play here that tell us more about the character. There's a cherry cordial that has part of its insides oozing out onto the sketchbook or the notebook nearby. There's a flower in a glass. Flowers will always have some sort of symbolic meaning. The coffee or tea that's in the foreground is tipped over, and it obviously looks like this figure has been working. They've just stood up and maybe they've tipped things over. So there's a momentary sort of, it almost feels like that cup is going to fall back down. We can almost hear it clanking back into place. The use of light. The use of light adds a lot of drama to this. We don't have anything written on the sheet, but we can see crumpled up sheets of paper. We can see a tipped over glass, an empty jar, an empty bottle on the right. We can learn a little bit about the character because of that. Maybe that's not wine, maybe it's blood on the lower left, dripped across the corner. We don't know necessarily just from looking at this picture. It accompanies more. It accompanies a text. It accompanies a story. And so oftentimes your picture is evoking something that's happening, not necessarily literally, but adding to the mood and atmosphere, reading between the lines. drawing pictures between the lines. Conceptually, this is a visual pun. Tempus fugit, time flies. So literally the clock face is being lifted off and flying, and the idea that that leads to our death, memento mori in the middle. Hero's blade, any of you who played Magic or any of the tabletop games, there's always props and artifacts and things that are evoking story just in their creation. We know it's a hero's blade. It's got this zing of light and color around it, so it feels like you would hear this epic soundtrack rise as the doorway opens on this blade and we see it for the first time. You can add story just because of your use of light, because of the shape and design. We understand more about the character who might wield this blade, and we obviously see a really interesting environment that it's set up in. Here we have retirement for a broadcaster for baseball. All the little elements that are going to help us understand it. He announced for the LA Dodgers, and he's been doing it for a really long time because we're evoking all these older looking microphone and radio. Even the old uniform and hat look aged and worn. Placement of your props through the scene. We know on the left one that 3 people have had tea. One person's had most of it, or tea or coffee, and they've been talking. There are notes and phone numbers written down, and they've been looking at pictures. Maybe they've been reminiscing, and they want to get back in touch with someone. Obviously, we have a children's theme here, and this is, speaking from experience, this is what it looks like to have kids. It is a mess, but this is a thoughtfully designed mess. Sometimes that just naturally happens, but this is absolutely composed and organized in terms of light and dark contrast, but it still looks natural. It doesn't look overly composed and gridded out. Light is telling a big part of the story here, Sunday morning, but we also have things that we would normally experience from, Americana. Sunday morning, we do the crossword, we read the puzzle or comics, we read the newspaper, we have a cup of coffee. This is someone who's a little older, they've got smaller reading glasses, and probably not to the age range that's entering college right now, but it tells a story about a particular type of person. As would this, someone who likes to golf, someone who's going to go to the country club afterwards for drinks. Advertisement for this whiskey brand. And last one, similar to the hero's blade, but we have a fallen hero here, someone who's no longer with us. The lighting and this setting help to convey that idea that they've maybe been lost, and no one's going to find them again, or when they do, it will be someone who's stumbled upon them. So hopefully all of this information adds to the idea that you have a lot of ability to tell your story through the way you compose your image, not just what you choose to show, but how you choose to show it and what you choose to do with the lighting, shape making, patterns, and organization of paths for the viewer to go through, whether it's repetition that's leading us around or literal lines that move throughout that image. So I hope you experience a lot, kind of a awakening of what you can do with that compositional material, and that you have some fun playing with that for our projects this semester. Thank you, everyone.